This Day in History. I'm your CCS student body historian, Caroline Code, and today's topic is the attacks on September 11, 2001. The attacks on 9/11 were attacks committed by the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Members from this group hijacked 4 airplanes and 2 hit the Twin Towers in New York. 1 hit the Pentagon and 1 plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people died that day, including many members of the military, law enforcement, and emergency personnel. Today I'm joined by Mr. Hyde, who teaches history and Spanish classes here at CCS. In addition to that, he's retired from law enforcement and military. He is joining me today to talk about the effects of that day on law enforcement, military, and ultimately the United States. So we'll go with the question that I think is most impactful. How do you think that day changed America's military strategy?
So changing military strategy, America has always been a proactive versus reactive military. So with that, we had never felt vulnerable to the point where we could be touched. That showed America, not just our military, not just our government, but our citizens, the people that live here, that we are in fact just as vulnerable as every other nation out there. Showed us where our weaknesses were and where our holes were. Made caused things to really be stepped up and pretty much revamped the entire military as we had it at that time. We also went full force and tried to correct the situation over east.
And do you think that, in respect, the same thing kind of happened to having to change the inner workings of law enforcement as well?
Absolutely. We saw a lot of people come together in law enforcement. A lot of men and women lost their lives, not just in law enforcement, but also through public safety, through our firefighters. Of course, we had the 353 that lost their lives in the towers. But it changed things all the way across the board. You know, law enforcement prior to that had always been a show up, take the bad guy to jail at the end. We all had to come together. You had officers from all over the United States, people from Wyoming, that got in their cars without question, signed off duty, off shift, and drove to New York to go help sift through rubble. So many people stepped up and, as true Americans should, did their civic duty, did their job, and really came together.
Yeah. Do you remember what you were doing that day, and if you were the ones who went out?
So no, I had actually just finished working a night shift, and I remember waking up and watching, I turned on TV and seeing everything happen. I was actually not even married yet at that time. So I know Miss Katie, my wife, and she was still going to school in Springfield, Missouri. She was supposed to board a plane that day and fly home. So it was definitely a stressful moment for her as well, and for me, because two of us, of course, were dating at that time, but not quite yet married. So there I had my girlfriend halfway across the United States and getting ready to get on a plane when things were so terrifying. So nobody knew what was happening with even getting on planes. All flights were grounded all the way across the board, and nobody really knew what to do. We hadn't expected it, so we didn't know how to handle it yet. So it was several days of hysteria and panic.
Yeah. I know of many relatives who, one actually was about to get on the plane that the hijackers had, but he thankfully missed his flight.
So my aunt was actually working at the Pentagon when the plane crashed into it.
Well, thank you for your time
My
and
pleasure.
your insight into a day that probably many of our student body does not remember being alive for. And thank you for your and thank you for your service and your time for the country.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you, viewers, for taking the time to watch this tidbit of history. And I hope to see you next week on the next episode of This Day in History.